All right. We got Mr. Thomas Eddelem here. But before we get to him, I have an ad to read. As many of y'all know, most of y'all, unless I have new listeners, in May of 2024, quit smoking after 28 years. I couldn't breathe doing menial tasks. I'd walk down my driveway, I'd be short of breath. I'd try to rake the yard or weed eat or something like that, and I just couldn't get through the task. It was driving me crazy. It really had me jacked up because I was always in pretty good shape despite young lung problems when I was younger. But I decided to quit smoking, found nicotine pouches, and Alp is the one I settled on. Alp is the best nicotine pouch out there. I like the wintergreen, 9 milligram. Um, really brings me the solution I need to any time I get stressed out or having anxiety. I can just throw an Alp in and I'm good to go. As y'all have heard, UPS lost my last order, but damn it, they're looking for it because I'm on their ass. So hopefully I get my Alp soon because I'm tired of all this other crap. Because all these other brands, they ain't worth a shit. Alp is where it's at. It has the best flavor, longest lasting flavor, and 9 milligrams of nicotine. So stop smoking, stop dipping, get Alp. And with that, we're on with the show. Mr. Thomas Edlum, you are the William Norman Grigg figure at the Institute. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that's me.
Awesome.
Yeah, I was friends with Will Grigg back in the 90s. Well, up until his death, from the 90s up until his death. So, yeah.
Yeah. I I know Scott has nothing but great things to say about him. I've read some of his stuff. I have the book Scott uh, published a couple of years ago, No Quarter, and that was awesome. That had, what was it, the rantings of William Norman Grigg or whatever it was.
Yeah, I wrote the introduction to that. It was so much fun just rereading some of his old stuff. He was just the most brilliant person I ever knew. Just pure genius. He would think instantly so many steps ahead. One of my favorite jokes or stories, William Norman Grigg stories is to tell is, and some people have heard me before, have probably heard the story, but we used to work together at the New American Magazine, which was part of the John Birch Society. And I was in the research department, and he was the senior editor. And I went up to him one day and I said, "Oh, the lead singer of NXS died, an Australian band, and that was popular in the 80s.
Yeah.
I kind of like their music." And he said, "Oh, I hadn't heard that." And I said, "Did you hear what he died of?" And he says, "No, autoerotic asphyxiation." And it turns out not to be true, but that's what the rumor was going around.
Right.
And quick as a lick, he says to me, "It's the second most embarrassing thing that can happen to a man."
What's the first?
That's what I said, right? And he said, almost dying of autoerotic asphyxiation. Now, all right, I had to look up what autoerotic asphyxiation was at the time. I didn't know what that was. And
Right.
then, but he knew everything. And then he had thought up, okay, I didn't know this, but I'm gonna do this joke. I'm gonna say this, he's gonna say this, and then I'm gonna say this back. He had thought that all up in less than 2 seconds.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was just hilarious. Yeah, I mean, he was always funny, always kind, just a really, stand-up guy. It's a shame we lost him as young as we did. I mean, he was only 54.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I used to, I'm really into like heavy metal, and one of the bands I listen to are, they're not around anymore, but it was a band out of Ireland, and they wrote a song called Carradine's Closet about autoerotic asphyxiation. And
Ah,
if you're into dark humor, I recommend go check out Druggernaut Carradine's Closet. It is one of the sickest, most disturbing, hilarious songs you'll ever listen to in your life. So
okay.
that's as deep as I'm willing to get into that conversation.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough.
So in the libertarian space, and I'm sure that other people hear this saying too, and I think this is a perfect way to dive into a conversation on tariffs. There's a saying, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so
Yeah, yeah, that's Thomas Sowell, one of
Thomas
his
Sowell,
favorite
right?
lines.
Yeah,
And that's true. I mean, unless your solution is the trade-off. I mean, but yeah, I think that's true. There's always the other side of the coin. There's always another impact. If you want something, you have to pay something in order to get it. Um, it doesn't mean there's a winner and a loser. Usually, if it's a voluntary trade, you presume there are two winners.
mm,
I go to the grocery store. I want those grapes I bought Sunday more than the money I had in my wallet, and or actually it's plastic, but whatever. And the supermarket wanted my money more than they wanted the grapes, and we're both better off.
right. So with this, let's get into first thing I think people are really questioning, and it's pretty absurd, is the way that the Trump administration has decided how to uh, how to calculate what reciprocal tariffs are before we get into what responses we've heard from these guys. And so we'll talk about that for a minute. So break down the formula that they were using.
Right. I mean, just for your viewers who are new to this whole thing, a tariff is just a tax on an import. All right. So, because you buy an Audi or a Ferrari or grapes from Chile, as I did this weekend, and in order to bring it in the country, you have to pay a tax. And usually, what happens is the consumer raises the price on that. A reciprocal tariff is basically this: uh, we sell Fords in the United States, and we sell them to Japan. Japan sells Toyotas all over the world, and they bring them to the United States. They sell Toyotas here. And if Japan charges 20% for Fords, well, we're going to, even though if we had a 0% tariff before, we're going to say, look, we're going to raise ours to your level. And we're going to charge 20% for Toyotas. We're going to do reciprocate. With the idea behind reciprocal tariffs is, I mean, the way it was sold with the Trump administration is we'll negotiate for lower tariffs. Everybody will lower their tariffs and we'll all have a fair deal.
Right.
The That's not how it worked out. What they did was it's almost like they had a number 10 envelope at a dinner meeting and they said, oh, well, let's see how we're going to do these tariffs. And the formula was this: 10% for everybody, regardless, and more if the United States had what's called a trade deficit with that of the other country. And they basically took the trade deficit, put it in a numerator, and then they took the total amount of goods that this host country buys from the United States and got in the denominator, and then multiplied it by 0.5, 50%, and that's how they got their tariff rate. Well, it doesn't really, that's not reciprocal in the sense that a lot of times a lot of these countries didn't have any tariffs. I mean, one of the ones that got the highest tariff was a little tiny country called Lesotho in South Africa. I think it was something like 90%.
It's yeah, it's Lesotho. It's a little
Lesotho.
land,
Oh,
yeah. It's a
you
little
would
land,
know, right?
yeah. It's a little landlocked region in South Africa. It's mainly tribal. They don't export anything. People utilize their land to mine diamonds out of, but they don't have any industry to speak of. I was talking to my wife about this yesterday, and she was laughing. She's like, "What are they exporting? Horses? Because they're known for
Well,
breeding
diamonds,
horses."
right? No, but
Well,
they're exporting diamonds.
well, they don't actually mine the diamonds. They don't have like a government to like think of, like, or any kind of industry there really. It's outside influences coming into their country, mining diamonds and selling it. They're getting ripped off
Right.
constantly.
Oh, I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. But the point is, the diamonds come from diamond mines in
Right, right, right,
Lesotho.
right.
Is that right?
Yeah,
So
Lesotho. Yeah.
they 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 are sold in the United States. Maybe whatever De Beers sells them in the United States, and that's charged against Lesotho. And then all of a sudden, oh, now we don't. They don't happen to buy a lot of American goods because, like you said, they're tribal. What do they have?
Hmm.
What do they have used for Chef Boyardee? They don't. All right.
Hmm.
They're so as a result, they're going to get this high tariff, but it really has nothing to do with them imposing tariffs on the United States. And if they did, we really wouldn't care anyway because they don't have much of an economy.
Right.
But that's how it was calculated.
Hmm.
And you know, the MAGA movement was sold a bill of goods on this. I mean, they were lied to. The idea that we were told as Americans, hey, I'm just going to raise it so that they'll negotiate and get it lower. I mean, this has upset the whole global trade regime. I mean, we have multiple agreements, the U.S., Canada, Mexico free trade agreement, and then of course the World Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization. Those all have specific set tariffs at maximums, and the United States is just blowing them all up, and it's creating chaos. That's the main problem. I think most of these tariffs are going to be struck down by the courts anyway because it's unconstitutional. The president cannot raise taxes under the Constitution. Only the House of Representatives can initiate a tax increase. Article 1, Section 7. So I think it's all good. But in the meantime, there's going to be this chaos. And if you look at even the news over the last weekend, Audi announced that they're not going to send any more cars to the United States until everything gets sorted out. Well, that means we're going to have shortages. And a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm not going to buy an Audi. I don't care." Yeah, but what if you're like me and you like grapes and in the early spring? They don't really make them in the United States in the early spring for the most part. Or what if you like mangoes or pineapples or some sort of tropical fruit or some sort of fruit that's not in season here? You're going to have a tough time getting them. Or
Right.
if you do get them, they're going to be very expensive.
Hmm.
And that's just food. There's all these other logistical problems that get created because of this chaos. One of the arguments that was made during the New Deal was Roosevelt was just doing everything random. He was just, we're in this recession or this Great Depression. Let me try this. Let me try this. Let me try that. And what happened was a lot of businessmen just held back and said, "I'll wait till the chaos starts because I don't want to lose my shirt because all the rules change mid game." And that's what the
Right.
businesses are doing right now.
Right. So, so on how they configured the tariffs, I'm gonna defer to Howard Lutnick, who was on Bloomberg, and so we'll get into his comments here. I wrote down three separate things here. Two of them was his comments, and one of them was my comment on his lack of comment. So he said, as far as it goes, there are non-tariff trade barriers. So you have a VAT tax, the value added tax, which is charged by a lot of European countries on American goods. And he said that sits around 20%. He's like, they don't count that as a tariff, but really it acts as a tariff. And then you have the subsidies for production. So you have the government subsidizing different different corporations, different industries in order to promote that industry, whether they're sometimes they'll subsidize their electricity, sometimes they'll subsidize their steel for automakers, something like that, in order to help the business come up under cost so that the United States corporation cannot compete. So he says, we want these governments to lift these subsidies, to lift these VAT taxes off of these products so that we can compete in the market. We allow their products to come into our market and they have access to our consumers. And so they're getting rich off of our backs. Now, this all goes back to this this theory that many in the Trump administration, whether it be Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick, JD Vance, I've heard a lot of different people from the administration say that what happened was after World War II, Europe was so decimated that the United States allowed all these taxes on U.S. business so that the Europeans could get wealthier and rebuild their countries. But here we are, some 80 years later, and they're still taxing us in the same fashion, which is destroying American manufacturing because America can't export goods to these places. So the reason that America imports more than it exports in these industries is because we can't compete in the market. He went on to say that there are some countries that have zero tariff that do not allow American products to enter in. I noticed one of the headlines over the last few days is the EU is lifting some of their regulation against for the green economy. So they're lifting some of the regulations, forcing car manufacturers to go into the electric car business. Then he said, as far as figuring out how we charge the tariffs, he said the Council of Economic Advisors with the United States Trade Representative publishes a book called Trade Barriers about the tools used by other countries to stop American imports. He was then asked directly, well, what about this formula that we figured out that you took um, the the deficit versus the profits of the other countries, and you divided it by two, and that's how you come up with this percentage that you're going to charge other countries for reciprocal tariffs. He didn't answer that directly because the questioner, the interviewer, continued to talk, kind of like I am right now, and so he kind of brushed past that and then put another question on him about how how they're going to balance this out. Basically, what it boils down to, from what I gather, is the way that Lutnick and Bessent and Trump, because Trump's been talking about tariffs since, I mean, the 80s. There's a clip with him with Oprah from like what 1988 or whatever it was, where he's talking about tariffs. I mean, this has always been one of his things, right? Which is classic Democrat, really. I mean, he fits right in with any of the 80s or 90s Democrats. Just like I've always said, Donald Trump is Bill Clinton. That's who he is. That's what his policies are. He's no different. So it looks like their assessment is that Vietnam, by having a 2% tariff on Vietnam, and I'm just using them as an example, coming into the United States, selling their products in the United States for lower prices, has then driven down the wages of American workers. Okay. And because Americans aren't willing to work for $7 an hour, it's put these companies out of business that are unable to compete with Vietnamese companies because the Vietnamese companies, the wages that their laborers are getting are so low. And so they're saying if they want access to our um, to our market, to our consumers, they're going to have to sell their product at the same price an American retailer would then sell at. And so, therefore, we'll put these tariffs on to force them to increase prices. Does that sound about right about what they're looking at?
I don't think they made that argument. That was definitely an argument that Democrats made. Dick Gephardt made back in the 1990s against NAFTA and against the World Trade Organization. But I don't think that the latter argument, the wage differential, has been the Trump administration's argument. I definitely the taxes and the subsidies, they've mentioned that, those both, but I don't think the latter. Let me take those issues one by one.
Yes, sir.
Um, subsidies is an easy one. When a foreign country subsidizes their industry and makes their foreign goods cheaper, it helps us as consumers. Always keep your eye on consumers, because we don't get wealthy by work. That's the process. But we're wealthier when we consume, right? I mean, that's what we that's why we work.
Mm.
So if let's I used this example in a previous podcast, and I'm going to twist it in a little bit, but let's say you get a big country like Japan, and they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take over the auto industry and a couple of key industries worldwide. And what we're going to do is we're going to sell to America. We're going to subsidize automobiles to the point where every American will be able to buy, a brand new Japanese automobile for $1. And we're going to subsidize airplanes so that every American will be able to buy a Japanese airplane for $2. And we're going to subsidize shipping to where every American will be able to buy a large ship, not just a canoe or something, but a giant steamer for $3. Okay. And every American, we go and Americans buy the dollar car, and if they want, they get the $2 airplane and the $3 ship. And American industry goes and the auto industry folds, goes on and does something else. Same thing with the aircraft industry. Same thing with it. But who's better off? We spend $25,000 for a new car. Now we spend $1, and we have the same car. Who's better off? We used to have to pay hundreds of dollars for a plane ticket, and now all we have to do is gas it up. We've got our own plane. You want to take a cruise? You used to have to buy tickets. You can just cruise yourself. All right, we're better off. We're richer. Of course, in the other podcast, I said we're much better off on December 6th, 1941. But on December 7th, there might be a different issue. The idea that there are military applications for some of these things, and a lot of countries, including China, have industrial policies for that reason. I'm not suggesting that that's practical. I mean, think about how much the Japanese consumer and worker would have to suffer to give every American basically a free car, a free plane, and a free boat. It's just logistically impossible. Even a larger country like China could never do it. So I'm not really worried about, oh, well, they'll do that and it'll be the end of, America will be invaded and we'll have another Pearl Harbor. I'm not worried about that. But we get richer by subsidies. So I'm not really, the idea of they're cheating us by cheating their own workers and consumers and taxpayers, that does not follow. Now, the second one, the tariffs, are why we can't compete in the market. And the tariffs are why we can't compete in their domestic markets, right? I mean, if the Europeans have a prohibitive tax and they charge 100,
that on
100%
top
tax
of
on America.
I was just going to say that on top of like these regulations that.
Right. I mean, that could be why we can't compete in their market, but it's not why we can't compete in our market or other markets around the world. So, and if you look at our American history, world history, tariffs are at record lows around the world, everywhere. The tariffs were very high all around the world 20 years ago, and even higher 30 years ago, and even higher 40 years ago. And yet we were able to compete then. Why is that? If tariffs and other barriers, which are so much less now than they were before, well, why were we able to compete when the tariffs were higher and the other barriers were higher back in the past? I don't buy that argument either. I mean, I do buy it that we're not able to compete in their domestic markets, but Americans should be able to compete in American markets, and Americans should be able to compete in markets where there aren't high tariffs, because not every country is going to have an automobile tariff to keep out foreign imports. I mean, if Guatemala is not, because they don't make cars. They're not. Why would they care? They might have a tariff, but they'd probably have a tariff for the same for American cars or German cars or Japanese cars. It wouldn't make a difference. So I don't buy that as an argument of why America is not competitive. I have my reasons why we're not competitive, That's not it. Um, Lastly, you made the argument that the Democrats made in the 1990s about the wage differential, and that's true. There is a huge wage differential between the United States average worker today and the average worker in Vietnam today, or the average worker today in Indonesia. But think about it. You and I are you in your 50s. I'm in my 50s. Okay.
I'm 45. I just look like this.
I'm sorry. Well, you know what? You know what threw me? The last podcast you said I was smoking for 26 years, and I was like, he probably started, when he was, when he was 20 or whatever. Okay, but well, even then, that would be, yeah. I can't do math.
I started
That's
when I
why
was 16. Yeah, I smoked for
yeah,
28 years. I started smoking when I was 16. Yeah.
yeah. Well, anyway, I'm old enough to remember, and when the the cheap stuff was made in Japan because the labor costs were so bad. In fact, even as late as 1988, there was a movie that came out called Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. And
Hmm.
he went into an economics classroom, and the professor said, well, let's just say they're making tape recorders, and we're importing them and we're going to make them. And Rodney Dangerfield said, oh, the Japs will kill us on the labor cost. Even in the 80s, which by then it was probably not true. One of the things that is beautiful about capitalism, that I love, is that it does seek out and lift up those who are the poorest
Mm.
for the most part, like when it can. Uh, Once Japan was wealthy, then the factories left Japan, they went to Korea. And when Korea became wealthy, they went to the Philippines and to Vietnam and to Indonesia. And once those countries become wealthy, it'll go on to, if there's another poor country, it'll go there. And I almost see that as, I mean, I'm a Catholic, and one of the doctrines of Catholic social teaching is you have to have a preferential option for the poor. That you have to sort of do what you can to help the poor. And I see capitalism as almost doing that, because what it does is it takes the labor and capital and puts it where it's needed the most, where there's the most human suffering. And a
Mm.
lot of people see that as, oh, well, we're exploiting that labor. But if you look, we we built Japan up into a wealthy country. We built Korea up into a wealthy country by exploiting that labor. And it's going from country to country, making them wealthy. And even though the the a lot of that capital has left the United States and is not currently helping the middle class advance. And the same thing goes with Japanese middle class and the Korean middle class. It is helping the poorest of the poor around the world and lifting them up. So I I understand where people would say, oh, well, there's a wage differential. And it would be nice to get them back, those jobs back, but I'm not sure people would, when they saw the cost, that they would appreciate how little it actually lifts up the average working person who's doing that kind of labor compared to the cost that they would pay at the supermarket, at the drugstore, at whatever store where the materials are being purchased at the consumer level.
One of the things that people are going to say about that is, yeah, we've seen the quality of life in Vietnam, the quality of life in Japan, quality of life in China, the quality of life in all these former third world countries have been raised to um, to standards, but now we have a homeless epidemic. Now you have to have an app on your phone if you live in a city that tells you where there's human feces, and so you can avoid it. So what we've done is we've replaced their poverty with our own poverty. And the job of the United States government is to look after its own citizens and not worry about Vietnam citizens. Vietnam citizens are Vietnam's problem.
Yeah, I mean that one of the things about capitalism is it is not it doesn't it's not patriotic. It does look after, it's a sort of a
It's a
universalist.
bottom line.
Well, no, it's well, I mean, I think it helps people, but again, it doesn't help people just because they're Americans. It helps people because they're people, and that's fine. I think when we look at what would help people, trying to rip those jobs back is probably not the best way to do it. The even in the 70s, when a lot of the cheap goods were made in Japan and manufactured in Japan, the the wages, not so much in the 70s, but the 60s, the 60s were when Japan really started going up.
Hmm.
All the factories moved there, but the American middle class kept going up. Well, why is it if the factories were moving abroad? Well, it's because there's other reasons than just the kind of labor where you manufacture shirts, where you manufacture simple items. That kind of labor is not going to pay as well as, well, the jobs that we have in America today, the tech jobs, the more sophisticated manufacturing, the things that require a little bit more knowledge. And I think what has set the American middle class back is not so much some of these factories that gone abroad, but our tax system, our inflation policy, and in fact, the inflation and the Fed's policy and the money printing has had a huge impact of forcing some even more of them abroad and impoverishing directly the American middle class in a way that random market forces never would,
Hmm.
because back in 1819, David Ricardo wrote this great essay about what he called the theory of competitive advantage, where he basically showed that two countries trading freely, even when one was much more efficient in everything than the other, it's better to have free trade than to have restrictions on trade. And he
Hmm.
used the example of, he was a son of Portuguese immigrants to England, so he used the Portuguese making port wine or wool coats and the English making port wine or wool coats. And this was 1819. It was after the Industrial Revolution in England and before the Industrial Revolution in in Portugal. And the English were more efficient at everything. They were more efficient at making port wine even than the Portuguese.
Hmm.
So what he found was it's best to let England do what it does best and not worry about the port wine jobs going to Portugal. Let the
Hmm.
Portuguese do what they do best, and everybody is going to be individually richer. It's it's one of the it's one of the great essays in economics, and it's only maybe 4 or 5 pages. I used to have my high school economics students read it and do some questions and a little chart based on a little chart that I created
Right.
to kind of understand how it works. But everyone should be reading that today, I think, because we assume, oh well, if some of the more menial tasks go to Portugal and some of the more sophisticated tasks stay here, well, then we create this overclass in America, and and we lift up Portugal, and then the American middle class gets shunted down. But that's not how it works. And it's how do I put it? The the Americans doing what they're most efficient at is the way that the Americans get richest, and it's just as simple as that. So trade barriers are not going to get America richer. They're going to get Americans poorer. And the the tariff is a relatively what we call regressive tax, in that for the most part it's going to be paid by poor and middle class working people as opposed to the rich people. Now there are exceptions. I mean, there are Ferraris coming into the United States, and only rich people are going to buy those, and if you tax those, then that's going to be paid by rich people. But when you look at the quantity of goods and the kind of goods coming into the United States from in the form of imports, even just from food. I mean, coffee. Most of the coffee is imported. We're going to put a tariff on that, and who's going to pay that? And, well, I love coffee. I just finished a cup. I'm about to start on my whiskey, but regular working people are going to pay that. The tropical fruits that come in off season, or even the regular fruits that come in off season, and bread, vegetables. There's just so many things that people will pay, and we don't really see it because we don't. It's not like it's a sales tax that's on the register. Oh, this is how much the tariff was,
Mm.
but it's there and it's hidden.
Yeah, Jim Ricards was on
Okay.
trigonometry this past weekend. Oh, we're having a little connection issue. I think we're back. There we go. Um, you know of Jim Ricards?
Yeah,
Okay, so he was on trigonometry this past weekend.
I don't.
Okay, so he says that we're in a recession already, as evidenced by low interest rates. He said when the Federal Reserve passes out higher interest rates, that's evidence of a wealthy society. What would you say about that?
No, I wouldn't. Well, we may be in a recession already. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta puts out predictions for the GDP growth, and the traditional recession definition is two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, and they projected that the first quarter of 2025 was negative growth. So we're likely to have that in the second one, and that would make it a recession. And so it's quite possible. But the idea of high interest rates being a wealthy nation, I think they are associated with, well, it's a bit. Could you read that again? Because I may have misinterpreted what he said, the
So
second part of it.
so yeah, he was saying basically he's like when the Federal Reserve like runs rates down to like 0.25% or 1%, that a nation is already in a recession, and that the Federal Reserve is trying to blow up that bubble and kind of keep it floating so that it doesn't burst on the citizenry. But when the interest rates are sitting between 3% and 5%, that the economy is actually at its healthiest. That's basically what he was saying.
Hmm. I I wouldn't. I don't know if I would say he's wrong, but I wouldn't say, well, if it's between 3 and 5%, it's at its healthiest. I think letting markets determine interest rates is better, and a healthy society generally does have a higher interest rate. 3 to 5% is not that high, but when you think about it, we've got a almost 3% inflation. So if you have a 3% interest rate and 3% inflation, the real interest rate is zero.
Mm.
So that's not very high. I'm not saying that they should be restrictively high. I think the markets should set them. I know the Federal Reserve likes to think, well, what we'll do is we'll stimulate the economy if it's going to recession. We'll lower interest rates, and it's strike. I'm shocked that everybody, Austrians like myself, well, not like myself, but other Austrians, Keynesians, everybody says, oh, well, this stimulates the economy. I can't find any data to show that. And whenever I look at interest rates, when they're dropped, whether it's the act of dropping them from one to another or just having low rates, can't find any impact of stimulus. And if you look at the United States since the 1970s, we used to have 2 out of 5 years we had 3% or greater growth, economic growth, GDP growth. 2 out of 5 years. Since 2000, 1 year, and it was the COVID snapback. And what was the difference? Well, there's plenty of differences, but one of the key differences is the interest rates have been super low until 2022. They went down in 2000 and they went up briefly in 2006, but that was it. They went back down into the basement, and we never really saw high interest rates until 2022, 2023, 24. And even they are not that high. In fact, 5% interest rates when you're having 8% inflation is still negative interest rates. So I've found no evidence that this is stimulative, and and everybody believes it. I went down to New Orleans for uh, a Koch brothers confab. It was funded. It was organized by Walter Block, who was this famous Austrian school economist, wonderful guy. It was 12 teachers of high school teachers of economics. And I said to him, I can't find any evidence that lowering interest rates helps the economy. In fact, it seems to be associated with slower economic growth. And he was dumbfounded. He's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. But everybody believes that. I guess I'm the only one who doesn't.
Yeah, I think what Jim Rickards was saying was that when you have a higher interest rate, then people that are giving loans are actually making money, and so it's a sign of a healthier economy because there's more money exchanging hands, and so he's saying that a lower interest rate is a sign of a weak economy, a sick economy, because there's less money exchanging hands with the lower interest rate.
Yeah, I don't know if there's less money exchanging hands, but I agree with him that a lower interest rate is going to produce a sicker economy and vice versa. And a higher interest rate is going to be a much healthier
Okay.
economy. I think he's right on that. Yeah, I misunderstood from when
No,
we
that's
first read it.
okay because like it's one of those things that's worth like fleshing out. It's not the easiest thing for average people to like understand what's going on because our heads aren't in this world every day, thinking about these things. So it's nice to kind of flesh it out and talk through what's being said here.
Right, right. I think I can find I published at the Libertarian Institute a a graph showing the different growth rates from I think it was the 80s through probably 2024. And, and let me see if I can find it. If I can, I'll throw it on the screen here. But let me see.
Yeah, let me see. Go to
GDP growth, interest
share
rates.
and I'll advance to multiple participants. Is that is that what I want to
Yeah,
do?
I don't see it.
No,
I know I published it recently.
all participants. Okay. Yeah, so I got it set up to where you can share now. Just so if you do find it, I'm going to move
Okay,
on.
cool. Yeah, well, I'll throw it on the screen. Yeah, do that.
Yeah, one of the things you were saying a while ago was you were saying a tariff is a tax. So not
Yes.
only does Jim Rickards dispute this, Scott Bessent was disputing this. I believe this was on the Tucker Carlson podcast where he said there was an MIT study that came out in 2023 or 2024 that showed Trump's 2017 tariffs only increased prices by 0.7%. And so the way that Jim Rickards was explaining this is price. All right, tariffs are charged on importers who negotiate prices with the producer, which equals a minimal price increase on consumers. So the tax is essentially paid to the treasury by the importer and then negotiated between the importer and the producer to lower the cost of the good before it even hits the shelf and the consumer even gets it. And so the real struggle isn't for the consumer, the real struggle is for the CFO of the producer. And since the CFO doesn't want this headache, it's the producers that are funneling money into the political systems that are convincing the political systems to argue against tariffs because the CFO doesn't want to have to deal with it. The corporation in itself doesn't want to have to deal with renegotiating, um, reorganizing the way that funds are spent in producing these goods.
Yeah, it depends on which kind of commodity you are talking about, because it's quite plausible that you could have a tariff that doesn't change consumer prices at all. I like to think one would be oil. When if you think about it, the United States is is a net oil exporter. Okay, but by the way, I believe I'm sharing this one graph
Yeah,
on
I can see it.
GDP. Yeah,
Yeah, I'll get you to
yeah,
explain it as soon
G,
as you get through with this response.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we're a net oil exporter, and if we had a tariff on oil, probably what would happen is the same thing that happened in 2022 with Biden shutting out Russian oil. The supply chain would go bonkers because nobody would want to ship oil to the United States from another country. We do, even though we're a net oil exporter, we do import a lot of oil. So what would happen is they'd sell it on the open market. Everything is priced to within a penny. So they're not going to sell it in the United States. So the price would go up to $5 a gallon. And then very quickly, the supply chain would realign and Americans would only use American oil and the leftover would be exported and the price would not change because the global price would still be roughly the same.
Hmm.
On the other hand, a 25% tariff on something would very likely increase prices by 25%. If you were to say, for example, do a tariff on diamonds from Lesotho, and the diamond miners were at a very low profit margin, which they probably don't, but let's assume that for a moment that they do, they would either not sell their product here or they would increase it by whatever the tariff rate is. So it really depends on the product.
Okay.
That's my answer. It's
Oh,
yeah,
okay. I just
it's
thought that was an interesting argument that I heard put forward a couple of times. Coming from the Austrian school, it's pretty common to hear that, well, tariffs are a tax on the consumer, and then they're coming back and they're saying, no, that's not necessarily the truth. This is what we've found through data and through actually implementing tariffs. And I was like, well, that's interesting. If that's true, then that's a really interesting fact.
yeah, it depends on what is being tariffed and what the market is. That
It's
it's in
fair
that
enough.
entirely.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, just to show you this screen thing before I stop sharing.
Yes, sir.
What I went to Fred, and this was an article I published last year with the Libertarian Institute. Real per capita gross domestic product percent change from a year ago. Was it higher or lower? Obviously, it's lower during recessions, but if you look, the highs were never as high, except for that one COVID snapback year.
Mm-hmm.
And the big change since 2000 has been 1% or 0% interest rates, with the exception of 2006 and 2022 to present.
Well,
So
there was also the World Trade Organization opening up to China in 1999, right?
Yes, the final round of GATT, which created the World Trade Organization, did add China. It added a whole bunch of it lowered tariffs globally for
Right.
almost every country,
Right.
and a lot of subsidies were restricted as well.
Yeah.
Subsidies and regulations. Of course, countries occasionally get around that because they get lobbied to do the opposite, and we do too. We have
Hmm.
tons of subsidies for electronic vehicles. We have, Tesla made its money by just sucking up federal and state tax subsidies. So
Hmm.
we do it too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I just want to make sure that, like, if you're saying, well, the only thing that changed, and then somebody's going to come in and say, wait a minute, did you forget
Yeah.
about
No, there's a
this?
lot of things that change. No, but my point is not that's the only change in the economy. My point is if lower interest rates stimulate growth,
Hmm.
stimulate GDP,
Right.
then why have lower interest rates created lower GDP growth? It doesn't make any sense. I
Right.
mean, where's the data? Where's the data? I haven't been able to find it. No
Well,
one has
yeah.
showed me. I went back to school.
Well,
I
you
went
would be
back to school
less,
in 2019.
you
Go
would be
ahead.
more restrictive on giving a loan to somebody if you're going to make less money back on the interest, right? And so if you have a higher interest, if you have higher interest rates, then you're a little bit looser with your dollars. You're like, yeah, I'll give you this loan because even if this person defaults on it, I know I'm getting 5, 6% from this guy over here and this guy over here as well. So, it hurts the lender
Yes,
more
that's
when the
true.
interest rates are low.
However, oh, it definitely does. I mean, banking became obsolete in 2000.
Yeah.
Banks went out of the business of encouraging people to put your money in the savings and checking account because they know it's useless. They they still have money in checking accounts and they're service providers that way. But almost every bank is now a credit card company, and almost every bank is getting into businesses that they otherwise wouldn't get into because it just doesn't make any sense to put your money in a bank. Why would it? The interest rates are so low. They pay you less than 1% even now. Why would you put your money in there when the interest rate's 1% and inflation's 3%? It doesn't make any. That's just a terrible financial decision. Unless you need it to pay your monthly bills, you wouldn't do it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So I want to cover a couple of more things if you have a little bit more time. I want to cover that video I sent you earlier today and talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that.
all you need.
So friend of the show, everybody that listens probably knows Cyprian. Used to go by the name Vin Armani. Um, he uh, he put out a video last night talking about tariffs, and it was last night for us. It was today for him, but he put out a video talking about tariffs and what Trump's tariff plan is. And he's talking about onshoring dollars and that the whole point of the plan is not to move manufacturing back to the United States, not to make trade fairer, but to onshore dollars. And you had a very interesting response to the video. I'd like for you to share before I ask you any questions about your response, because I do have a couple of questions about what he's saying and if this is actually the case, what it could mean.
Yeah, I watched the video as well. And one of the points he made was that 60% of printed dollars are now residing abroad. So there's, I don't know how many trillions, let's say there's $10 trillion. Well, six of those $10 trillion are in China, Colombia, London, and other countries. And he says that the goal of the Trump administration is to bring those dollars back to the United States. But my concern was, well, wait a minute, we just spent 2 decades offshoring all those dollars, which kept the CPI, the consumer price index within relatively tame levels compared to what it otherwise would be if all those dollars were chasing the same amount of goods here in the United States. If
can
we
you
were to
do
bring them
can you
back,
yeah
think about it. If 60% of the exit,
no, I was just gonna.
go
I
ahead.
think I think you're going where I was gonna ask you to go because Daniel McAdams and I had talked about this a couple of years ago. But with the money out of the country and overseas, it doesn't contribute to the to inflation. Is am I correct about that?
Well, I mean, the Austrians are nitpickers about defining inflation as an increase in money supply. So the inflation has already taken place. But as far as what we might call price inflation or the consumer price index,
Okay.
if the dollars are abroad, they're not really bidding up domestic goods.
Hmm.
So if we send those dollars abroad, then they're not bidding up prices here in the United States to the same extent that they otherwise would. So if all of those dollars come back, I mean, think about it. If you've got 60% of the dollars abroad and say they all come back, well, that means you increase the amount of dollars here in the United States by 150%.
Hmm.
All right. So it more than doubles, halfway to triples. Now, in 2020 and 2021, they increased the amount of dollars the Federal Reserve printed. I think it was $4 trillion. I'd have to look at the actual number. If you
Okay.
look at the M2, which is printed dollars and checking accounts and savings accounts, I think it increased by about $4 trillion. And it was about 40% of the total currency in circulation. And we got elevated inflation from that. We got 8% one year, and I think we got 6% another year. And we've had higher than average inflation since then, even though the Federal Reserve has pulled back and taken $1 trillion of that money out of circulation. What
Right.
happens if we increase it by 150%? Then the CPI, we're Argentina. Where
Hmm.
the the CPI could go 20, 30%, maybe more.
Okay.
So
A
that
couple of
worry.
questions, a couple of questions about that point that you just made right there. So when you're seeing that inflation kick up despite the Federal Reserve sucking up $1 trillion out of circulation, is that possibly a result of foreign nations coming into the United States buying real estate? Because I know that is something that has been happening over the last like 10 years. China and Canadians, other citizens of other countries are bringing American dollars back into the money supply here
No, no, this
stateside.
is the Federal Reserve taking money out of.
Right, right. But I'm saying the reason that
No, no, when
inflation
they
can
have their numbers, it's
I'm sorry, we have a delay. I apologize.
no, no, that's all right. I I I don't think, first of all, the numbers don't of the amount of currency in circulation are the total amount, domestic and foreign. So that's, if the Chinese come here and buy real estate, that's not going to impact the amount of dollars in circulation.
Okay.
It might, however, impact domestic price inflation, or if you will, the CPI, because the Chinese come here and they all of a sudden now they're using dollars again in the domestic market. So
Right.
that might impact.
Okay.
But this gets back to the point where I say keep your eye on the ball, which is prices for consumers. That's more important than prices, or jobs for manufacturers, because the manufacturing interests, the people who run the companies, they're always saying, "Oh, we have all these great workers or whatever, and we're going to be able to employ all these people." But if you look at the per capita, how much it's costing, it's actually better to just cheaper for consumers to just put all those workers on welfare than it is to
Okay, we froze up there. The last thing I heard you say was welfare. are having some serious connection
Yeah, well, if you
issues.
look back at one example is, gee, I'm not having it on my end, but that's okay. Can you hear me
Yeah,
now?
I don't. It might be me. It might be
Can
me.
you hear me, Tony?
The
No?
weather's been a
Okay.
little weird here.
Okay. 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 No, my point was if you go back to the 2009 bailout of GM and Chrysler, it would have been cheaper for taxpayers to give employee of GM and every single employee of Chrysler a check for $100,000 to find a new job than it would have been to do the bailout.
Mm,
I mean, that's how bad it was. That's
right.
that's the math of it. So it doesn't make sense to do the bailout via tariff either. It's always going to cost more to do it that way than it would just to let the markets sort themselves out and let people find jobs in the area where they're most efficient according to the price mechanism.
Right. Okay. So one of the questions I do have about this that because as soon as I started reading your comment, this was one of the first things I thought of. All right. So if we take what Jim Rickard said about the importer then pays the treasury, right? He takes the tariff is implemented on the product being imported. The importer pays that price at 20%, whatever it may be, to the treasury. The treasury then takes those funds. If we're onshoring 150% uh, over what we already have in the current circulation in the United States, is it possible that the thought process is the importer pays the treasury then takes that money and pays down the debt and begins to funnel that money towards the debt? And
Yeah,
so it never enters circulation. You see what I'm saying?
yeah, I know what you're saying. That could, in theory, happen, but just like the idea that, oh well, we're just gonna do retaliatory tariffs so that they lower it. It's there's not really a plan to do it. Just like the idea we were sold on with, oh, we're just gonna take the tariff and we're gonna replace the income tax with it. It's just not practical. It's just not practical. The income tax raises $2.9 trillion every year, and we take in 3 trillion in imports. I mean, just do the math.
Mhm.
We couldn't possibly do 110% tariffs on everything and expect imports to be the same. It just wouldn't work.
So let's get into that then, because one of the plans that I've heard Howard Lutnick promote, it's a little bit more ambitious than what I've heard Donald Trump promote. So Donald Trump has said no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, which I've been working overtime since I was 17 years old. I'm 45 now. That's a lot of years to be working overtime. I'm down for it. I'm like, quit taking, you know, 60% of my overtime pay and dumping it into the federal government who just wastes it on transgender studies in Peru or whatever the hell they're doing right now. Um, so I'm down for that. I think that's a good move. That's a very populist move. I think that'll get a lot of people behind Donald Trump if they can work that into the tax bill, which apparently that's what they're working on right now. From what I've heard, and just keeping up as much as I can between Speaker Johnson and John Thune. They're negotiating how to fit the no tax on overtime, the no tax on tips into the current big beautiful bill, as they call it, that they're working on. I think that's what really the holdup is trying to figure out that tax part of that bill. Um, Howard Lutnick, on the other hand, has come out and said, I believe this was on the All In podcast, which if y'all don't listen to that, y'all should go listen to All In podcast. I learned a lot from those guys. They're tech billionaires and investors, and I get a lot of information from those guys. And it really helps me out in understanding uh, economics from that perspective, if nothing else. So Howard Lutnick, when he was on the All In podcast, said that the goal is, before Trump is out of office, is to completely decimate the IRS to the point where there's no income tax on anybody making $150,000 or less. Okay. So that's like my entire family no longer pays income tax. Now, the way I look at that, okay, is I come from a voluntarist background, as you would know, anarcho-capitalist. I don't really see myself in that light anymore. I'm much more adherent to an orthodox kind of perspective, which with the orthodox Christianity, but it's not so far off. And I can look at it and say, okay, isn't it more voluntary to have higher prices in the grocery store, higher prices on the car lot, and I can choose what I spend my money on than having this money confiscated from me like I've had my entire life. And to me, that's a little bit more of a voluntarist kind of like less intrusive tax proposal than what I've lived with.
I agree that the tariff is much less intrusive, and it it is, at least if you get rid of the income tax for the under 150,000 set, it's going to be much less regressive than it otherwise would be.
Right. Okay.
I just don't see the numbers matching up. I just don't see that. I mean,
Okay.
it's nobody's put the numbers to it. The I By the way, I want to argue with not argue with you, but I want to make the case that Christianity is basically libertarian. I mean, if you go back even to the Old
Oh, it's very
Testament,
close. It's very close.
you know,
Very close.
I mean, you go back to the Old Testament, they had a theocracy, but there were no taxes, there was no draft, there was
Hmm.
no there was a voluntary contribution to the temple, but that was it. There was no,
Hmm.
it wasn't mandatory, and at the as they were looking for a king, the Israelites said, "Ah, we want a king just like all the other countries." So they went to this guy Samuel and said, "See what God can do." And God said, "You tell them this: they're I'm supposed to be their king. They're not supposed to have another king.
Right.
They've rejected me as their king, but I'll give them a king, and it's a pretty good king. But they're still going to get taxes, and they're going
Yeah.
to get wars. It was a punishment for that. And
Well, and
if you look all
we're still reaping that reward too.
yeah, and all the way up to Jesus, they were
Mm.
he was asked, is it lawful to pay the tax? And he says, show me the coin. And of course, it's one of those tricks, right? They think, oh, we've got him. If he says
Yeah.
it's lawful to pay the tax, then he's betrayed the Jews, and we can get him that way. But if he
Hmm.
says it's not lawful, well, we'll turn him over to the Romans because he's protesting taxes. And
Right.
he gives the perfect response. He says, "Show me the coin." They give him a drachma, and he says, "Whose image is on this?" They said, "Caesar's." And of course, in the Old Testament, one of the things they're not supposed to do is have graven images.
Hmm.
And Caesar's he's claiming to be a god. So he goes, and give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. In other words, why do you have these graven images in your pocket in the first place?
Right.
That was his response.
Well, and another thing I've heard that I thought was very interesting is man is made in the image of God, and Caesar was a man. So when he says whose image is this, it's almost like a double entendre.
Right, right.
But yeah, no, I agree with you. And this is like I've explained this several times, but I think it's funny because the reason I stopped calling myself a libertarian in 2019 wasn't anything to do with libertarianism. It's because,
No, I heard you the other day. Yeah.
yeah, Tucker Carlson had said that Hillary Clinton's foreign policy was libertarian. And I was like, nope, If that's what the mainstream thinks libertarian is, then I'm gonna have to find another label. Now, the only thing that we would argue about possibly is the reason I say that I had come from it from a more orthodox perspective, which I think that Christianity and libertarianism are very similar. Don't get me wrong, but the libertarianism allows for the hedonism, and that's the only thing that really bothers me.
Right, but how do I put this? It doesn't mean we have to embrace hedonism.
Oh,
It just
right.
means it means we can be like Jesus. I mean, today, I went to mass yesterday, and they did the reading of the woman found in adultery, which is one
Mm.
of my favorite Bible stories. And they're all ready to throw a stone at her. She's found in the very act of adultery, and they just have the woman. There's no guy,
Yeah,
and
exactly. Where's the man?
and and they're saying, and it's another one. We got him either way, right? The Romans won't let us put anyone to death. So if he says throw stones, now we've got him there. If he doesn't, he's betraying the law of Moses, and he says, "Let he who's without sin cast the first stone." And I always thought, gee, I wonder if this woman was kind of the town prostitute, and she'd been with all those men, and they all knew that she knew, and that's why none of them threw the stone. But even so, they go off one by one. But at the end, he says, "Has no one condemned you? No, sir, not one." He goes, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more."
Right.
Right. So he says, "I'm not going to use force against you, but at the same time, I'm going to correct you. I'm going to say, go and sin no more."
Hmm.
That's the Christian view, and that's also the libertarian. We're
Right.
allowed to correct.
Well,
Let me
in two,
evangel. I don't know if
two
I'm evangelizing on behalf of Christianity or libertarianism either.
well, two things on that story that I always found interesting. So the Orthodox have a tradition that when he's kneeled down and he's drawing in the sand, that he's actually writing down the names of the concubines of each of the people that are there, threatening to stone the lady.
Wow.
And
Wow.
then and then another thing is he says that those without sin let him throw the first stone. He was the only one there without sin. So he was the
Right.
only one capable of throwing that stone.
Right. Right. So where were we on the question? We got distracted.
We did get we got you got derailed. um I think we were I was asking about, oh geez, I forgot now. Yeah, we got completely derailed there. Um well, let's just move on to my next thing. When you're looking at a man and he's saying, "Look, Mises and Rothbard, they said that people act with intent, but they meant that from an economic lens. That they said that people act in these ways because of economics. But the reason I did what I wanted to do, like let's say me, for instance, I drive a truck. All right. I watched Smokey and the Bandit one too many times. And I wanted to be like Smokey. I wanted to be the truck driver, and back in the 80s, the average salary of a truck driver adjusted for inflation was $110,000 a year. But now the average salary for a truck driver is $43,000 a year. Like, what did they do to us? Like, is this from the trade? Where did this come from? What did they do to us? And you could break this down in so many ways. You could have like a fourth generation farm or a fourth generation business, and you're talking about, well, the price of vehicles has come down. And he's like, yeah, the price of vehicles may have come down, but when I was growing up, my dad always drove a F-150, and now I'm forced to drive a Ford Focus because I can't afford an F-150.
Yeah, I can't believe how much they are. I when I got out of college in '87, right before I got out, I bought a Ford F-250 for 12,000.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's adjusted for inflation. It's maybe 35 now, but now they're all 60,000. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Right.
And I don't I can't account for that. The But the other cars, regular cars are cheaper when you adjust for inflation. I would say the number one, well, there's two reasons why people are the median person is not so much poorer, but struggling much more, right? If you look at median income for the American household or American family, 1971 versus today, it's maybe about 20% higher by the CPI standards. But that's not much in 50 something years. It went up by 50% between 1946 and 1971. So
Mm-hmm.
that's 25 years, it went up 50%. But in the next 50 years, it only went up 20%. That's that's slow growth. Well, who's who's stealing from the middle class? It's the Federal Reserve Bank. The most regressive tax is inflation. Inflation is a wage theft. That's all it is. It's wage theft because, and this goes back to the 1700s with the French slash Irish economist Robert Cantillon. He basically said, when new money is created, the one who gets it last is the one who is the loser, and the ones who get it first are the ones who are the winner because they buy up the goods before the prices go up.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have inflation, well, the government creates it, they get it first, so the government is getting more powerful. And then it goes to the financial industry. Well, the financial industry is a bigger part of the GDP than it's ever been, and that's gotten richer. And then it goes into real estate and all the other things. And the very last person is the working man.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look at it from another perspective too. Inflation is a drop in the value of money. So the people who trade in assets rather than money, they do fine because they're not going to lose anything. So real estate developers are fine. The people who deal in antiquities are quite fine. In fact, real estate developers, if they are using mortgages, they're better than fine because inflation is taking away their debt, slow motion, sometimes fast motion. One of my favorite stories is one of the plasterers I work with. It's from Venezuela. He came to the United States in 2015, but before he came, his friend said, "You got to buy a house." He goes, "Why?" And he'd just gotten out of college, and they said, "Oh, inflation's coming." He says, "What are you talking about?" And he agreed to buy a house, so we put together a 30,000 bolivar down payment and got a loan for 300,000 bolivars and bought a house and moved to the United States. He's got family living in it and he's paying the mortgage. And the mortgage is, like 2 to 1. So or 10 to 1. So his mortgage payment was like $250 ish. He comes to the United States a couple of years later. His wife says to him, "Honey, the mortgage payment just dropped to less than $1 a month." And he's like, "What?" And so he looked, and of course, the mortgage was in bolivars, and there was hyperinflation in Venezuela, and they still owed 75% of the principal. It should have been $25,000 or more that he owed.
Right.
And they looked, and they could pay it off for $120. Well, that's an extreme example of how inflation helps real estate developers. It's the same thing with my dad when he bought his house in 1971 and it's just a 4 bedroom colonial in metropolitan Boston, but where the property prices are elevated and stuff. But I went to Wisconsin when I got out of school the first time, and this was 1989. I came back. I said, "Dad, I got this great apartment. It's only $290 a month. It's right across the river from Lawrence University. I can use the library there. It's great." The old man went white. He said, $290 a month, that's more than my mortgage. And the thing is, he had bought it in 1971 before all of the inflation of the 70s had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And his mortgage was peanuts by the time I was out of high school. So think about it from the perspective of a real estate developer. He's probably, if he's a billionaire, he's going to keep 20% equity in his properties. He's got 80% debt. Every time you have just a few percent inflation, he's going to get tens of millions of dollars in loan forgiveness. However, a working man, well, the poorer you are, the less credit you have, right? I mean, a lot of people, we like to think, oh, that, gee, the poorest people are the ones who have lots of debt. That's not true. The poorest people, the people that don't even have credit.
Hmm.
And the poorest person is the person that his only asset is his labor. And he loans his labor to his employer until payday, right? He works for a week, sometimes two, sometimes a little bit more, and then he gets his paycheck. Well, inflation hurts creditors and helps debtors. So the poorer you are, the more it hurts the working man. And also, if you don't own a house, if you're really poor and you have to rent, what's the first thing you do if you want to rent an apartment? You go to the landlord. He says, "Okay, I want first, last, and security deposit."
Hmm.
You're loaning your landlord the money, and then when you get your paycheck, what do? The first thing you do is you go to the bank and you put the money in your checking department, the checking account. You're loaning the bank your money. A lot of times people think, oh yeah, well, banks are big creditors. No, they're not. The business of banking is the business of being in debt. The
Hmm.
banking wouldn't exist without depositors. There wouldn't be a bank. So the only way they do any business is debt. So if inflation helps debtors and hurts creditors, it helps banks. And guess what? Banks are doing great
Yeah.
because of inflation. But working people, not so much. And then, of course, the other big thing that's hurt of working people is the payroll taxes that have gone up. They skyrocketed, especially in the 80s. To now it's 15.3% of a person's paycheck goes to Social Security, Medicare. It was back in the 60s. It was only 5%. Back in 1935, it was 1%. I mean, what was it? Ida Mae Wells. I think she was the first person to qualify for Social Security to get her 10 quarters in, and she had paid like $46 or some astronomically small sum, and she retired on Social Security, and she lived a long life, and she had gotten over $1,000 out of Social Security because she got her 10 quarters in, and that was it. And she only put in 1% of her pay. Well, now they're putting in 15.3%, and you're living, you you're not just putting in 10 quarters. Most people are putting in 50 quarters because they 50 quarters, not more than 50. They're putting in 120 quarters or more because they've got 40 years times four. It's they've more than that, right? 160 quarters. So yeah, like as soon as I got my economics degree, I stopped learning how to add and multiply. But they they they're putting in a ton of money. And one of the stories I wrote for the Institute last year was that if the average person retiring in, I think it was January of 2024, had been allowed to invest in the stock market, he would have retired with 1.2 million. And everyone likes to say, "Oh, well, yeah, but the stock market goes up and down." But as long as you just take 7% out of an S&P 500 fund, you will never run out of money.
Hmm.
You will never run out of money. Even if you put your money in at the peak of the 1929 crash, you take 7% out every year, you will never run out of money. So,
I heard, yeah,
when
it's funny you say that because I heard they were talking about that on the All In podcast the other day. I think it was when Andrew Schultz was on their show, and they were talking about if Social Security had taken that money, instead of putting it into federal bonds, if they had put it into the S&P, it would be at just from 1971, I think is what he said he calculated it at. It would be 17.5 trillion dollars in value um, of Social Security, whereas right now it's at 2.7 trillion. So just putting
yeah,
that money in
and
the
here
S&P would have like multiplied it like 10, like what, six, seven times. Yeah.
absolutely. And when you think about it, the Federal Reserve, their entire goal is to suppress Treasury bill interest rates. And as a result, the last 5 years in a row, the Social Security Trust Fund earned less than the rate of inflation. So they've taken literally $1 trillion in purchasing power out of the trust fund using the mechanism of creating inflation and suppressing interest rates. So, the Democrats who defend Social Security and then defend the Federal Reserve are doing they're doing an insanity. It's kind of like Bernie Sanders, going on this tour against all of these warlords or whatever he calls them,
Oligarchs. Yeah.
the big oligarchs and the billionaires. When at the same time, he was the guy that voted to make Elon Musk a billionaire by pushing all of these subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
He put billions of dollars with his votes. He put billions of dollars in Elon Musk's pocket. And Bernie Sanders, same thing. If you go to foreign policy, it's the same thing, right? He voted to give Israel a blank check for whatever they wanted to spend. Now he's criticizing Israel for its war on the Gazans. I don't know how anybody follows the guy. He just criticizes everything that he built up.
Yeah. Okay. I remembered what we were talking about a while ago before we got derailed. Income tax under $150,000 a year getting gotten rid of. You said that tariffs would be less of a regressive tax if that were the case, but you don't see any evidence for that occurring.
No, I mean my history with when I was with the New American Magazine, the John Birch Society, is I love to go and do research on old tax policy because I'm a dork, and I learned about the tariff going all the way back to the beginning, to where Hamilton wanted a protectionist tariff, Jefferson wanted a revenue tariff, and we got iterations of both throughout the 19th century. And the revenue tariff is kind of a regressive tax, the progressive tariff, the protective tariff more so. But if you were to get rid of the income tax for poorer people, then it wouldn't be as regressive and it wouldn't be as intrusive for poorer people. But I also learned from the discussions on the income tax, both I should say the Civil War income tax, the 1894 income tax that was declared unconstitutional, or is actually 1893 tax, and then the 1913 one that they right from the beginning wanted to just go bonkers spending and increase the rates. So it would be a super temporary thing. They would bring the rates back down. Right now, if you look at the tax rate for working people, if you add up income tax, the payroll tax for Social Security, Medicare, and inflation, it's higher than it was during World War II on the working people.
Mm-hmm.
That we're paying for a world war, but there's no world war. That's what the average worker is paying right now. It's insane. The tariff is the least intrusive tax because, as Jefferson bragged about in his inaugural address after his second election, hey, guess what? No American, unless he's in the business of importing, ever sees a tax collector of the United States. We're running the whole federal government on tariffs and the sale of federal land. That's how the whole federal government is run and was run all the way up till the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And after the Civil War, they went back to mostly to the tariff. They had a tax on alcohol and tobacco too, and that was right up until they got the income tax.
Yeah, Federal Reserve that was created in 1913. Shortly after that, the income tax came into play, and it's been a madhouse ever since then. Okay, one last question. This is something I heard Tim Pool talking about the other day, and what he was saying was that you have to understand with the barriers on trade that that countries like Japan have, to where you'll like if you go to Japan, you're not going to see an American made car. If you go to Europe, you're not going to see an American made car. If you go to China, you don't see an American made car. But you come to the United States and you see cars from all over the world. And he said those barriers that keep these car companies and they keep that other American companies from um, engaging in the economies around the world, those the barriers that are put on them have created a surplus of American dollars overseas. And we were talking about this earlier about 60% of American dollars actually reside overseas and are not in the United States. And he said, with that surplus of American dollars, China, what they decided to do is they decided to start buying American debt. So they were buying off American bonds. And at one point, I believe China and Japan were the two highest holders of American bonds. But now, if I'm not mistaken, it's the American
That's true.
taxpayer holds more American bonds than anybody else in the world. And so when they saw that the debt was a failed strategy, buying American debt was a failed strategy. Buying American bonds was a no go for them as far as earning on their investment. They decided to start investing in American land, and the foreign nations intervening on American soil, buying American land, whether it's farmland, whether it's residential properties, commercial properties, whatever it may be, has then driven up the prices and has made it impossible at the income rate that Americans are paid today. It has made it impossible for the next generation to own homes and to actually live out the American dream by owning their own property and taking care of themselves. What do you think about that whole idea of onshoring this currency in order to stop these companies, I mean these countries, from being able to purchase real estate in America so that the next generation can therefore benefit from America and purchase real estate in the United States and have their own properties, their own homes.
Well, first of all, China was never the largest holder of U.S. debt. It was always taxpayers, but they were for a long period of time and may still be the largest foreign holder, just like
Okay.
Japan is second. And yeah, I think China holds a little over $1 trillion and Japan about the same.
Hmm.
And then Europe and the Arab countries hold quite a bit too.
Gotcha.
But as far as China buying up American land, that's a very tiny impact on prices. The number one, well, there's a number of things that contribute to high prices in the real estate market. One is the just the general inflation rate, because everybody says, I have this cash, it's losing value. I got to put it into something. Oh, I know a hard asset. It's called real estate. And they can finance it with debt, and the debt can go away with inflation. So that's number one. There are there are mortgage deductions, so you get a financial incentive to do that in the income tax. And the interest rates are suppressed by the Federal Reserve, so that creates an incentive. And the federal government lowers lending standards. With a HUD loan, you don't need 20%, you need 3% to get a down payment. So, for $25,000, you can buy a $500,000 home. There are all of these other factors that are raising the the property prices, and then also zoning rules are very restrictive in a way that they weren't in the 50s when income was rising faster than housing prices. The the price of housing is protected by government. Government
Hmm.
is dedicated to ensuring that real estate always grows in value, which is an insane proposition. What
Yeah.
People think and they take it for granted now. The realtors will tell you, "Oh, your house is an investment." Well, why is it an investment? That's like saying when I buy a pineapple, it's an investment. It should grow in value. Well, why would it grow in value? I want the pineapple to eat the pineapple. I want the house to live in the house. It should be going down like all of the other commodities that I buy. the price of television sets, of computers, all of those have gone down in real terms as well as often even after inflation. And the reason is because they've gotten cheaper. We've gotten better ways to manufacture them. And the same should be true with houses. The same should be true with all of the necessities of life. It's only inflation that keeps them propped up. And it's not China. China that holds, I think, I forget what was it, 38,000 homes in America.
Yeah, I
That's
don't know what all the numbers are, but I know a lot of people like
peanuts.
to talk about it.
It's
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's peanuts. I mean, there's almost 100 million homes in America, and they own a couple hundred, a couple tens of thousands. That's not going to raise the prices to where they are. And where China is investing isn't even in the top real estate markets. It'd be one thing if you said, "Oh, well, China's, they're buying in these four markets in New York City, Boston, and San Bernardino County, California." And gee, wouldn't you know, those are the highest price rates, but they're buying all over. It's not concentrated in high income rates. I think that's way overblown.
Okay, so one more question about that, because something that struck me is with when you have a growing population and you have a fixed amount of acreage as far as land goes, then the land would increase in value, right? Because there would be more people fighting for that land. And so then you would drive up the land. So how much do you think population and land actually being a zero sum game um, play into the price of real estate increasing regularly? I know that the government plays all kinds of silly games because people want this, long term and quote unquote investment to gain equity. But at the same time, there is that there there is the argument there's only so much land. And if the population of a nation is growing, then it's going to be less land per person, especially when the government owns so much land on the West Coast. How much does that play into it?
It plays a little bit, but keep in mind, land is not just two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. You can build straight up as well. And if you look at land rates all across the world, I mean, some of the biggest cities have some of the cheapest land costs. So I think it's more demand for particular pieces. I mean, let's face it, I live in the Boston area, one of the top, most expensive areas in the country. It's always going to be more expensive here than it is 50 miles west of here. That's
Right.
really that's reality. All I have to do is go out to the Berkshires. It's super cheap. It's super cheap.
When
And it's
Adirondack
because
mountains are supposed to be pretty cheap too.
yeah. So it's location and demand.
Yeah.
That's what's driving up the price. It's not, and also regulations. So, and some of those regulations, you might say, okay, well, why not have fire code? Why not save people? There were a lot of terrible, terrible fires in the 19th century because they didn't build to standards. But it's the regulations have gotten way out of control, and they've added enormous amounts to the costs of building, and they don't even relate to the safety of the structure. A lot of times, it's environmental code and all kinds of abatements that have nothing to do with building the dwelling. So I think you've got all of those other factors that are built into raising the cost of housing, whereas Chinese coming in or foreigners coming in and building houses. I mean, Chinese come in and they build a house. What are they going to do? They're not going to take it off the market anyway. They want to sell it or rent it to somebody. So
Yeah.
it's still going to be on the market. It doesn't that is not an argument that really plays well with me
Yeah.
as far as driving up the prices. And let's face it, prices for real estate have outpaced wages since the 1970s. China was not a factor in real estate until what, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? So, okay, let's say China is a factor now. Well, what was causing all that stuff before?
Yeah.
It wasn't China.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a fair point. You know, oh, I can't think of his name on the top of my head. I have his book up there, The Case Against UBI. He talks about how the government has kept real estate prices growing and artificially, and that was in order to appease the older generations that wanted um, some their investments to translate into wealth for them.
Right. And it's them and real estate developers like Donald Trump and others. I'm not saying that Trump personally lobbied for those things, but he certainly benefited from the fact that, gee, real estate has as in value has outpaced everything, but I think even stocks. I mean, if you look at purchasing a property and renting it out at a slight profit, and then you've got the diminishing mortgage costs and because of inflation, it's and the increase in sales value. You've got it's hard to go bankrupt in real estate, although I guess
Mm.
Donald Trump has managed. But I mean, it's very difficult to do that because all of the incentives are for everything to go up, and it doesn't go down. Whereas in most other commodities, most other product areas, the prices go down. If not, maybe not the raw price is unadjusted for inflation, but at least adjusted for inflation, prices have gone down in most areas,
Mhm.
and but not in real estate. And the reason is government has propped it up,
Mhm.
and that needs to end. That needs to end because it's shelter is a necessity, and it's an imposition on free exchange right now. The way
Well, we want
it's working,
our kids to have better opportunities than we had, you know,
right?
and that's driving a lot of this angst and anger and the reason that people support Trump in the mission that he is embarking upon is because they are so pissed off about the way things have been run for the last 100 years. And they see that their kids, I mean, I think this is the first generation that people believe that their kids have a bleaker future than they did when they were their age. And I mean, that's a sad statement. Like, you don't want to look at your children and be like, man, I'm really sorry. It got fucked up and I don't know what to do for you.
Absolutely. The current generation is fed up, and that's why they voted for Donald Trump because they looked last November. They looked at the two parties and they said, "Gee, all right, Donald Trump gave me a tiny little a tax cut when he was president, and what are the Democrats promising? Well, they didn't really give me anything in 2020. What's Kamala Harris promising me? Well, she's promising me unlimited pronouns." And the average
DEI.
working guy said, "Well, yeah, can I pay my mortgage with DEI? Can I eat my pronouns?" And they basically
Yeah,
said, "Well, no." Well, I have no use for you.
right.
That's what it came down to. The vote. I mean, a lot, everyone on the left was saying, "I can't believe people voted for a fascist," or they voted for a rapist," or I voted. No, they didn't. They looked at their pocketbooks and they said, "Look, I was a little bit better off under Trump during after the end of his first presidency, and I was a
Hmm.
little bit worse off under Biden. So I think I'll vote for a little bit better off." Now, Trump had nothing to do with how the American worker advanced during his presidency. In fact, he set in motion that most of the inflation that was created in 2020 under his presidency. It
Hmm.
continued under Biden, but most of it was under Trump. he set it in motion for the the reverse that happened under Biden. I mean, a lot of people don't. I'm constantly banging my head saying, I can't believe people are blaming Trump for the economy right now. I suppose for the tariffs, I suppose that's true. But for the most part, there's a year or two, or sometimes three delay
Yeah.
before a policy is enacted, before the effect happens. So, if you want to know what impact Joe Biden had, well, maybe you can start seeing that in 2023, and we still won't know the full effect until 2026. And the same thing with Trump won. We didn't know about Trump's impact until 2022, 2023, when the inflation started, because that's when the money printing happened. And the Fed did the money printing. It wasn't technically Trump and Biden, but they happened under both of their presidencies.
Right.
But people assume, oh, well, the gas price is this. Joe Biden is to blame or to credit if it's good or bad. I don't understand how people think that way. It's become such a team sport that, oh, whatever information is good, I'm going to say is to, if a person who's oh, that person is a right winger, is just simply someone I identify with the left and I disagree with that person, therefore they're a right winger. And someone who says that's a left winger, I identify with the right, and therefore I disagree with that person. I think he's a left winger, and that's all we do with information. Is if anything that's good that happens, it's because of my guy, and if anything that's bad that happens, it's because of the other guy.
Yeah.
Guess what? The sun is down right now and it's dark. That's Biden's fault, and it's coming up in the morning, and Trump is responsible for the sun coming up in the morning. That's how far we've gotten.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And I mean, I've admitted it in the chat, like when we're talking, and I'm like, man, it's so hard for me not to just be like, go Trump, because the people that hate him drive me insane. You know, it's
Yeah,
just like,
yeah,
it's like y'all are so condescending. Like, I can't stand it. It drives me nuts. And I'm just like, I want to. Well, and a second thing is, he's a president and he's doing this stuff. And I'm like, I hope it works, because my kids are in their 20s trying to find their way in this world and develop skills and start working and enter in building lives for themselves. It's like, how despicable would I be? Is like, yeah, I know y'all have y'all's own issues and y'all are trying to figure all this shit out, but I don't like that guy, so screw your future. I want him to fail. Like, I'm like, this is like, no, like, I'm not
yeah.
going to do that. I love my kids more than I hate anybody. So I'm not going to do that.
That's right. I'm just constantly besieged. I will say this: it's much more difficult to talk to a Democrat these days than it is a Republican, because if you disagree with them in the slightest, all of a sudden, you're a Trump lover, you're a MAGA. They don't even want to talk to you. They get angry.
Hmm.
Whereas the Trump people, you criticize Trump in front of the MAGA people, and they'll give you the side eye a little bit, but they don't. There's not that visceral hate
No, but they'll
that you
but
would
they'll
get
ask you,
from
they're like, wait, what do you mean by that? Like, why are you saying that? Why do you
right.
think that way?
You
You're
can
like,
have a conversation, whereas
right.
you can't
Yeah.
with the Democrats, and I think that's because of the way the media is set up. If you are in the bubble of the establishment media, I like to call it the captive media. Like in the old days when I was with the Birch Society, they used to call them the captive nations, all the nations under the sway of the Soviet Union. And the captive media, the media that are controlled by the deep state, the big five media companies, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the
Mm.
NPR, that's all they listen to. And they hear that there's a moral failing of someone that disagrees with them if they vote for Trump or if they
Mm.
have a different opinion. Whereas, at least with the the Republicans, the MAGA guys, they can't get away from that captive media entirely. So they're aware that there's another opinion. Whereas the Democrats, and then I wouldn't call them leftists even, they're Democrats. They would just say, I can't, you're morally inferior because you don't think the way I think. The Trump people, generally speaking, are not that way. There's a few, but it's not the same. It's not the same scale.
Right. Well, I put in the chat today. I don't know if you've been in the Libertarian Institute chat today, but I put in the chat today, like Crystal Ball went out of her way to defend income tax. And she was saying, look, y'all have to understand, tariffs are regressive. And even if what Howard Lutnick is saying, and they're going to like lift income tax on people making under $150,000 a year, that's a progressive tax. And that's good for you. And you should know. And I'm just laughing. I'm like, the mental gymnastics these people have to play to stay, I'm still on the working class side, even though everything I'm advocating is going to hurt the working class, is crazy. She went on saying something about how the reason that we have trade partners and we don't manufacture things in the United States is because the American worker expects to make too much money. I'm like, is this the same person that advocates for a $15 minimum wage? Like, what are we talking about? You are just like the cognitive dissonance is just insane with these people.
No, and the most regressive tax is inflation. They defend the Federal Reserve. The Social Security tax. Hey, that's a third rail of politics. You can't even talk about getting rid of the payroll tax, even though it cuts off at a certain income level. It's the reverse of what they're talking about with the income tax, right? It's they don't tax you over 100 something thousand.
Mm,
Like that's it. It's cut off. And why? Because Social Security, in theory at least, is not a welfare program. It's you pay into it and you get back what you put into it. So they say, oh well, if you make over $130,000, that's it. Everything over $130,000 is yours. You know,
mm,
they've since changed it with Medicare and a few other things, but it's the most they defend the most regressive taxes, and they offer working people absolutely nothing.
yeah.
Absolutely nothing. I mean, what did Kamala Harris offer the American worker? I mean, at the very end, in the last 6 weeks, she said, "Well, I'm going to help come up with a first-time down payment for people." Well, who cares if you already have a house, if you're middle class and you already have a house, or who cares if you're working at Starbucks and you can't get a good job? You're never going to be able to make the payment anyway. I mean,
Right.
that's good for a handful of people, but that's not. It's not a tax cut like Trump gave the middle class back in 2017, where we all got maybe a couple $1,000. I mean, that's something. And admittedly, all it did was increase the deficit, which was then printed and turned into inflation. And we paid 5 times that amount back in inflation. So we ended up behind the eight ball. But at least he pretends to be on the working people's side. They basically said, oh well, what are you going to give the working people? Well, we're going to tax the rich. Well, how does that
Mm,
help me? Well, we're going to tax
right.
the rich. But
Right.
but how does that help me? Well, we'll give you more money with the tax for the rich. And it's like, wait a minute, you're running a $2 trillion deficit. The entire discretionary budget, they 3/4 of the budget now is mandatory, and 1/4 is the defense and USAID or whatever. The entire discretionary budget is now deficit.
Right.
So if Congress votes this year to spend a penny, it's a deficit spending. Whereas uh, everything else is already accounted for. All of the taxes are already accounted for and already spent even before Congress meets, even before Congress is elected. It's already spent. Like
Hmm.
we have a zombie democracy. We have a democracy of the dead because spending by Congress is determined by not Congress today, but Congress in 1935,
Hmm.
because Social Security was created in 1935 and the payments were set then. Now, Congress would probably approve those again. They'd probably rubber stamp them. But in 1935, they also created farm price supports. And that makes American consumers two-time losers, right? Because we pay farmers not to farm. So we have to tax the consumer to give farmers a subsidy. And the purpose of it is so that prices for farm goods, for food, is higher. That's the purpose of the program.
Yeah.
So we pay more at the grocery store and we pay more in the taxes. I think those would go away, but we have the democracy of the dead where that's automatic. It's automatic. Congress doesn't even have to vote on it. It's
Yep.
just spent. That's it.
That's it. Well, hey man,
I
we've
could
been
go on. I
going,
could go on and on.
dude. We could probably do this forever, and I'd get fired, and so would you. And I got to go eat because I'm starting to get hungry. So it's been
Okay,
almost 2 hours. So I really appreciate your time, Mr. Edlem.
Mr. Edlem, you got to call me Tom.
Oh, but I call me Tom.
I thought you were Tommy. You go by Tommy.
I
I
do
don't
go
mind
by
being called
Tommy.
Tommy either. I never used to. Growing up, I hated it, but when you get to be an adult, of course, I moved to Wisconsin as an adult, and at the time we had a governor there who went by name Tommy Thompson, and I was like, well, if he can do it, I guess I can do it. It's fine. So it doesn't bother me anymore. But I still introduce myself as Tom. So whatever. Yeah.
No, it's great. It
No,
was great.
it's been fun.
Yeah, this is great, and we'll definitely do it again. I usually the first time I have somebody on my podcast, I only do an hour with them, and you have definitely broken the record on first time appearances on the podcast as far as time. This was awesome. I really appreciate you, your fountain of knowledge, man, and I'm glad you agreed to do this, and definitely do it again.
All right. Sounds great, Tom.
All right, bud.
Or Tommy.
It doesn't
All right.
matter. I'm gonna stop the recording. Just don't call me late for
All
dinner,
right.
as my grandpa used to say.